QSO Today, episode 449, Ron Schwartz VE3VN. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I had the pleasure this week to have an eyeball QSO in the Jerusalem Central Bus Station with Darren Rhodes, KC0NAH, who extended his 10-day vacation to Israel to go north and do some SOTA and POTA activations around the Jezreel Valley, with Lewis, 4Z5OT, and Aaron, 4X6FB. From what I can tell from the special WhatsApp group that we created to make a successful visit for Darren, he had a great time and made many contacts. Ron Schwartz, VE3VN, maintains his enthusiasm for participating in CW contests using his SO2R station and tower farm. For more than 5 decades, Ron has been an avid ham radio operator and ham radio blogger with an enduring passion for climbing towers and rigging antennas. VE3VN is my QSO Today. VE3VN, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ron?
Yes, I am, Eric. 4Z1UG. This is VE3VN in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in eastern Ontario, Canada.
Ron, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. Can we start what your hometown was when the story started?
Sure. Well, I was born in Winnipeg. That's Victor Echo 4 land in the middle of the continent. Although I didn't know it at the time when I was young, that's people talk about W0 being the radio black hole of North America. Well, VE4 is worse. It's further north. We're right underneath the auroral zone, sort of on the edge. I remember talking to a friend of mine not long ago, V6SV, another contester, Gord Kosmenko, and he's up in Edmonton in Alberta, and he's about another 4 degrees further north latitude, and it gets increasingly awful. Any disturbance and the HF bands disappear. And I'm kind of lucky when I moved out here. But just going back to the beginning, so I first became aware of amateur radio. They're living in the suburbs of Winnipeg. And Winnipeg is a fairly good-sized city. At the time, it was probably about 600,000 people, and it's getting closer to 800,000 now. And out in the middle of the prairie with just open wheat fields all around. And I would listen to the radio, and then I found that at night, just playing with radio, the broadcast radio, the kitchen, 5-tube radio that we had at the time back in the late 60s, that I could hear stations at night that I couldn't hear during the day, and they were like all over the place. Other places in Canada, of course, mostly the U.S., because with 10 times the population, the amount of number of radio stations was so much more. And I just started playing around, and I started wondering, well, how does this radio thing actually work? And that's where I almost ended my radio career, because not knowing anything about electricity, I mean, I was still not even a teenager, and I'm poking around, and I was very curious. I was very good at math and science in school and all that sort of stuff, and I liked anything mechanical, even though I was too stupid to understand what I was doing. And I would poke around inside this radio when my parents were out, and I was just kind of like, I was grab it and drag it to my bedroom, open up the back and start, poking around in there. I knew that was kind of dangerous, but I would poke around, with a screwdriver. And one time I poked it, and I didn't realize at the time, but my hand had slipped down to touch the blade of the screwdriver. And the next thing I remember, I was on the other side of the bedroom, sitting against the wall, and barely able to breathe, my heart racing, and there was a smoking screwdriver in front of my eyes. And that was my first electrocution. And I survived it, and it didn't deter me. I just decided, well, okay, I just have to be a little bit more careful.
Well, I believe those 5-tube superheterodyne receiver, which is very common in those days in the Bakelite or plastic or whatever the housings were, those also didn't have power transformers, as I recall.
That's right. And all the filaments were in a chain adding up to 117 volts.
That's right. Having the chassis out of the case was actually quite dangerous.
Oh, it was extremely dangerous. But one thing I kind of noticed, and I heard this thing, people talk about shortwave radio, and it's at higher frequencies. And I kept reading about what that actually is. And then I started reading a little bit how super heterodyne receivers work. And I was still a little bit vague on the concept, but I kind of looked around and I saw these slug-tuned coils. Well, actually just one slug-tuned coil, because the antenna was just basically a loop of wire on the back panel. Of course, it's all plastic and cardboard back then. And so I said, well, it's at higher frequency, so what I have to do is turn this slug. So I did that. And the next thing I know, I was receiving higher and higher frequencies as the local oscillator went up in frequency. And I started hearing paging services and just about everything else. And eventually I started hearing thumping. Thump, 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 thump. You know, what's that? Because this is an AM receiver, of course. And I remember asking a friend of mine who was also kind of interested in this sort of thing. And he says, I think that's Morse code. You might be listening to ham radio operators. And I said, what's that? He told me a little bit about that. And then I tuned a little bit higher on this radio, and I started hearing, the old squawking. And I went back and asked him, what's that? He says, I think that's single sideband because hams don't use AM. And that's what it sounds like. And I said, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. I remember this is somebody else my own age and who, knew as little as I did, but he knew a couple of things that I didn't know. And I thought that was great. And I asked, what are they doing? Well, they're talking to each other. They said, talking to each other. You can do that on radio? And thus began my amateur radio journey.
Did you make use of your library at school for books on radio, and were they there?
I don't remember them actually being there, because at that time I was probably I'm not sure if I was still in elementary school or if I had started like junior high school, like maybe grade 7. I know I got books from the municipal library, one of the local city libraries, and I read a little bit there. But it's very difficult to understand this stuff. Remember, this is before I really knew any algebra or anything like that, so it was a little bit peculiar, and I couldn't really understand what they were talking about. And but I started getting a little glimmerings of what it was all about. And then about maybe a year later, the local high school, which had an amateur radio club, I didn't realize that, but you kind of go there. They had a big open house, and I went over there because I figured I was going to be in high school in a couple of years, and then the door was open. It was a radio club, and I said, "Well, that's interesting." And they were in there, and they were talking to other stations, like on 20-meter sideband, other friends around town. I mean, they were all teenagers, of course. I mean, they seem like adults to me because when you're like about 3 years older at that age, I mean, you're like ancient. And I was watching what they were doing. I didn't ask any questions. I was a pretty shy kid. I just kind of watched. I said, that's what I'm going to do. A couple of years later, I was in that high school. I had already resolved with a friend of mine who was in the same class as I was. We were going to get licensed. We're going to become amateur radio operators. And then we were the fresh meat in the amateur radio club. And as it turned out, I didn't realize at the time that there wasn't really anybody coming up behind. This was like 1971. And there was a guy there, Sid, who at the time was VE4ZS. I think now he's VE3XZS. He chose the suffix for that particular reason. He had moved to Toronto, and he went out into the world, and he was a few years older than me. So I guess he was in grade 12 at the time, and I was just starting in high school. And he was a very outgoing guy, and he says, "Well, we're going to get you guys all licensed." And I still actually have a picture of the radio club members at that time, and there's me with Sid and his big afro, and another friend of mine just off to the side, the one I was talking about, Rob V4GV. And he still has that call sign, and he is still very active. He's a contester like me. And we were egging each other on to get our licenses, and we did it. And at the time, actually, it was kind of annoying. In Canada, you have to be 15 years old to qualify to take the exam. And just before my 15th birthday, they rescinded that requirement. And I said, well, that's really unfair. I could have been licensed a year ago. And but and then Rob went and actually took the test without telling me. And he says, what do you mean you took the test? I said, yeah, I figure I'm ready. So he took the test. And there you just go to our, the U.S. equivalent, the FCC, the Department of Communications at the time. And they had a local office in Winnipeg. And you just go down there, just schedule a time, and you go down there and they give you the test. So I studied real hard. And I went in for my test. In the meantime, Rob, as I recall, he failed his test. And so he rescheduled a new test. And I went in and took the test. And this was in May of 1972. And I passed. And so I became licensed as V4OY in 1972, May. And so I've been a ham now almost exactly 51 years. And that call has been since reissued. So, some of these old two-letter calls, of course, they become fairly rare. So they get taken up again very fast.
How many hams were in the radio club?
Not many. About 10. I think the student body was maybe 1,000, something like that. Or, like 800 or 900. I don't really know. It was a big high school. Of course, this is the baby boom generation. So they were struggling to keep up with the wave of the population boom going through school and then university and all that sort of stuff. Like a mid-boomer, so that was a big thing. So we were really squeezed in there.
When you first licensed, what is the license grade that you had in Canada that allowed you to first get on the air with this new VE4OY call sign?
Well, it's all changed, since then. I mean, the license classes in the U.S. and elsewhere have also changed over the years. And it was called, I think it was just called Amateur or Certificate of Proficiency in Radio is what they actually called the certificate. The certificate to be a ham is different from a station license in Canada. So once you get the certificate, you then apply for a station license, and that's when you get a call sign. But back then, the process was very quick. And I had a call sign like within a week after having my certificate.
Did that give you all of the privileges? So there was only one class of ham radio service?
No, and actually that is kind of like part of my story as well, because it did play a role in that. On HF, it was all CW. But you could do full power, whatever was allowed, like 1 kilowatt input or whatever it was at the time. And there was no restriction on where you can operate on the HF bands, but no phone privileges except at, I think, 2 meters and up. And talking locally was never of any interest to me. And back then, in the early 70s, the FM boom was not quite a boom yet. It was just starting. I think there were maybe a couple of repeaters in Winnipeg, and that had no interest for me. But after 6 months, you were allowed to apply for an endorsement where they were to give you single sideband privileges on 10 meters. Now, this was entering a solar minimum. The peak, I think, was in 69, and it bottomed out around 75. So let's just say that there were no 10-meter conditions. So what are you going to do with that certificate or that endorsement? And at first, I didn't even have sideband rig. I had, I should also point out that I really didn't have any money. My parents were not well off. They were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They came over after the Second World War with almost no education, and it was a struggle just to keep us out of poverty. So I had no money. And I had a little bit of money that I got, for the background. My family is Jewish, so I had that usual bar mitzvah money. That is how I bought my first station. I still remember Sid, who I mentioned as my mentor. He knew everybody. I needed a receiver, so he dragged me around to different people who were selling receivers, and I bought one of those post-war Hammerland HQ 129X receivers. which is a horrible receiver, but for me it was a work of beauty. And at one of the flea markets, I bought for $17. I still remember this. It was a CW807 rig that had been converted from an AM-only mobile tube radio. Somebody had done the conversion, slapped a VFO on it. I don't even remember. I think it was a Viking VFO onto this substrate. It had an external AC power supply, and I got it all for $17. And that became my rig to get on the air. So I was CW only. So getting a 10-meter endorsement was useless. But my friend Rob, he was a little bit better off, and his parents bought him an FT101. And so he got his endorsement late in 1972, and I could only envy him. But one thing that we did is we got very active on 10-meter phone when I was finally able to upgrade my station. And that was like Hallicrafter's sideband rig, one of the early ones. I think it was an HT32. That was the one that used crystal filter instead of the phasing. And I had an HQ170, so I upgraded my Hammerland receiver, so I was able to get on sideband. And then we discovered this thing called sporadic E, which hit during the summer months, kind of peaks at the summer solstice in late June. And we discovered this in 1973. And suddenly I said, what is this propagation? The band is dead. The sun, there's no sunspots. And the band is alive with signals all over the U.S. And also some in Canada. And it's like, what's going on? And I fell in love with it. It was just fascinating what propagation could do, sporadic E. And that's what led to, a little bit later, my passion for 6 meters.
You were talking a little bit before about the aurora. Now, I just learned in the last episode, the aurora is like a curtain. It's not like the onion layer that the ionosphere is, right? So I'm assuming from what you're saying about being under the aurora, that the aurora would effectively block HF signals to the ionosphere, right?
That's correct. If it becomes intense enough, it either reflects it back down to the ground or it absorbs it. And so you never get anywhere near the F layer. And so effectively for most of HF, most hams would say, well, it's dead. But, of course, there's auroral propagation that is particularly interesting on VHF. I mean, you can hear it on HF, but nobody cares because it's short range and warbly, and so it's really just considered a nuisance. But when you get up to like 6 meters, it becomes quite fascinating. Of course, I started operating Aurora on 10 meters, but there wasn't that much in those days because at the solar minimum, there's also less Aurora. But so we didn't have the problem so much of Aurora, absorbing signals. It was just that the solar flux was so low and we were far enough north, and any disturbance would basically make HF next to unusable. Working DX was at that time quite difficult.
Are you saying that the majority of hams that might live in the area around Winnipeg or under the aurora don't operate HF, or do you operate HF differently?
No, you operate HF, but the thing is, when the aurora hits, you might go out and mow the lawn or shovel the snow or whatever it is you have to do, because we're far enough north. When the aurora hits, it's overhead, and it may extend also towards the south, and that's it. You're just covered by a blanket.
I see. But if you're on higher frequencies, you can actually use the aurora as your bounce to bounce the signal.
That's right.
Versus using 80 meters or 160 or whatever.
That's right, because as you probably know, the maximum usable frequency, even in a solar maximum, struggles to get up to, say, 6 meters or even 10 meters. And so when you have aurora, suddenly there's signals. And that's one of the things when my attention kind of focused on 10 meters after getting that endorsement and discovering sporadic E. Well, I was still there, so of course I would hear aurora, and I was wondering, what is all this warbling? And then learn what it was and realize that I could talk to people in adjacent provinces in particular, because they were also north. So you kind of reflect off the auroral curtain that might be a little bit towards the north or overhead. And of course, you'd also propagate backwards into, say, W0 and W7, W9, with the closer areas to where we were in VE4. And it was just fascinating that you could do that. And I always found almost anything about propagation quite fascinating, so I love that stuff. And although I was primarily interested in DXing on HF, stuff like that, I would switch to 10 meters in an instant to work an Aurora QSO, just for the pleasure of it.
Oh, that's fascinating. Now, did your high school radio station have a wider array of gear, or was the FT101 of your friend probably the best gear you had access to in those days?
In those days, but I wasn't using his rig, but it was fun to go over to his station and see what he had, because I didn't want to operate somebody else's station. I wanted to operate my own station. It just gave me like a spur, to somehow do things. I did eventually buy an FT101. I think that was in 74 or 75. And got rid of the old tube equipment. Of course, there were still a few tubes in an FT101. And looking back now, it's a really awful radio, but back then it was wonderful. And it's one of the few radios that I've actually bought brand new. I was finally 16 and making some money, and I was saving up for university, but I still, much to my parents' dismay, splurged on a new transceiver. They overlooked it a bit because they figured anything that kept me in school and interested in doing technical things they thought was wonderful.
So then what happened after high school? What did you do for your education? And did you follow an electronic line because of your interest in ham radio?
No. I looked at the options. One of the things that you find when you come from a household and a family with very little money is you get very anxious about money. So I started looking at careers that supposedly would pay well. My first love was actually astronomy. I wanted to be an astronomer and do the science and all that sort of stuff. That was my first interest. But when you're in Winnipeg and you have no money, although there were two universities in town, but the astronomy faculty at the University of Manitoba was you couldn't go very far in it. For that, you had to go elsewhere. And I realized that I really was going to have trouble affording that. So I decided that as much as I loved it, and it probably wasn't all that great a career choice anyway, because how well does being a scientist really pay? And it really wasn't that great. And then I looked at becoming an electrical engineer because of radio. And I decided I wasn't really into that, because the other thing that entered my life at that time was computers. And I was in the very first class, and it was also in 1972-73 that computer programming was offered in our high school, and I took it. And I found, much to my surprise, that I had a very strong aptitude for it. And they said computers are the future, just like, 10, 20 years earlier, plastic.
Plastics, right, if we remember The Graduate, a movie from that period.
So in the early 70s, it was computers. And I looked at that and kind of said, well, I'm good at it. I like it. And I just kicked the O-meter aside and decided I'm going to do this. And so I eventually ended up with a master's degree in computer science. And I started my career as a computer programmer. And that's when I moved out to Ottawa. But just, to back up a little bit, into university, there was also an amateur radio station, VE4UM for University of Manitoba. And I did a lot there, including putting my software skills to work, because they had a better station than I had at home. So I did some contesting from there, as did my friends. And so I had a lot of fun there. And that was really where, I skipped over a lot here in terms of my contesting career, but just to talk about the university for a bit. So that was a great environment. I would sit there with my course studies, doing software and mathematics. And once I got out of that, I went over to the university club station, and it was all electronics, CW. People were playing there with microwaves and with teletypes for radio teletype and everything else. And there was a tower and all that. And eventually they decided, well, you're going to be the station manager. So I was then responsible for the station. And it was actually quite a large station. For whatever reason, the university had a lot of money when they were building that particular building. And they gave the amateur radio club this huge amount of space. 3-4 times as much as we could possibly use, but it was wonderful. And so there was lots of room to operate contests. And, if you have a multi-op, then everybody had some place to crash, just throw a sleeping bag on the floor somewhere in a different room. And, using the latest Heathkit tube gear, they say at the time, and had a little tower there on top of the building, and tri-bander and a few things, and we had just tremendous fun. And my friend Rob, again from high school, was there, and met many others who were, not too many of them were interested in contests, but a lot of DXing, and so I loved operating there when I had a chance in between classes. And so that helped me build up my chops. And of course, I was doing tower work at that station and for other hams around town. And by that time, I had my own tower, small tower, about 50 feet. And also that began my long career in amateur radio tower work, always on the side. I've been doing that ever since.
And now this mid-show message. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that the podcast is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. If the sponsorship is not of your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages, beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have made transcriptions. There is a news section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This is generated automatically from my membership system. The following are new sponsors and contributors since the last episode. New sponsors include Martin Malley, W0ZZK, $100 annual. Gregory Graham, N5GSG, $10 a month. Glenn Jenkins, W4KTF, $100. He was my guest in episode 291. Donations include Mike Tinder, AA8IA, $150, whose generous support includes funding transcriptions that makes this show possible, and Robert Glorioso, W1IS, who was my guest in episode 441 and a frequent contributor to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. There were other anonymous donations made this week, and while I don't mention your name at your request, I do want to thank you all for your supporting QSO Today. Finally, you can support the QSO Today podcast indirectly by using our Amazon link on the show notes page before going to Amazon to shop. Amazon gives us a small commission when you use our link to go to Amazon. This is a very powerful way to support the QSO Today podcast while you shop. This commercial-free business model is called value for value, where you give QSO Today the value that is worth to you, no more, no less, in exchange for content that I've been generating every week since 2014 to the benefit of our ham radio community. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. Before you go on, in terms of what you were doing for computer programming, you said you went to Ottawa, which is the federal capital of Canada, right?
Yes, but I had no interest in government work. But Ottawa also had a large technology industry, and it was growing rapidly. There were companies like Nortel, Northern Telecom, which is, of course, long defunct, but they had their big research lab there, Bell Northern Research, that employed thousands of people. There were also the other big company at the time was Mitel Communications, which is still around. I eventually ended up working there for a few years, although I started my career there actually working for a computer service bureau, which was basically a big time-sharing outfit where we had several large IBM mainframes, and we leased time to large organizations and also government departments all around the Ottawa area and also beyond. So they would have computer resources because for the big things that these corporations wanted to do, things like mini computers haven't really progressed well enough, and microcomputers were still in the future, although they were coming on the scene very, very fast. And in fact, a company like the one I worked for very quickly found themselves, pushed to the side. They didn't survive very long after I left. But it was a wonderful place. I got to play around with, roomfuls of big IBM machinery, and it was a wonderful experience. But I was also, if I could just back up again about, software and amateur radio, one of the things I did when I was at university is because we were doing so many contests, and we knew that we'd been hearing about contest logging being done on computers. But it was all, individuals doing it. And but I kind of said, well, I can do that. So I got access to a mini computer. Actually, it was during the summer where I had a summer job doing computer programming for a local government agency. And we borrowed some equipment. Somehow or another, I talked them into allowing me to have access to the computer over the weekend and leave it online, and we would just dial into it. And I wrote the software in about 3 days. This was for the very first running of IARU radio support in 1977. The funny thing is I didn't operate the contest. A friend of mine, it was Derek V4VV, a good friend of mine who was unfortunately became a silent key many years ago. But he operated the contest from there. The software I wrote actually worked beautifully. And he used to tell me, he says, the one thing that he found just amazing was that when he worked a dupe, like somebody he worked before, because of course with paper dupe sheets, it was very difficult to keep those things straight. And he would tell them, no, we worked before. Then he would tell them what time. He said, check your log. And of course, back then, it was like magic. He says, how do you know we worked at that time? It just flabbergasted a lot of people. But it was on the leading edge.
He had access to a dial-up terminal, right?
That's right. He had a dumb terminal and 300 BPS telephone connection. We couldn't do 1200.
He had his ADM3 or something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember the old Bell protocol labels, but we couldn't use 1200 because it wasn't still very reliable on the analog telephone system, although we did have 1200 baud modems at work. I think we had 2 modems. I managed the modems as well because I was responsible for the computer there. So I did all of that work. So it wasn't difficult for me to make everything happen. I still remember the funniest thing. We talk about, bureaucracy and, bless them, the ARRL. He wanted to send them the computer printout of the log, and they wouldn't allow it. He said, computers? What's computers?
Oh, they wanted a handwritten log?
They wanted it on their official sheets.
Right.
And so he eventually had to transcribe it all by hand from the computer printout onto their official log sheets, and then produce a dupe sheet as well. It was the craziest thing. I mean, they soon figured it out, but it was quite funny. Of course, it was funny because I wasn't the one doing the transcribing; he was, but it was quite something. Unfortunately, I couldn't pull that off again, so I didn't do any computer logging until many years later.
But all of this time you were active in ham radio. You had a contest station. You were building a tower?
In Winnipeg, yes.
At your parents, who are more than happy to accommodate your ham radio hobby.
Well, I wouldn't call it like more than happy, but they hated to say no. But obviously, they're quite concerned, a tower, and I'm going to build it.
You're going to climb it?
That's right, and I was kind of tentative, and I still remember my friend Sid, V4ZS at the time. He was my mentor in high school, and he had a tower just like that, and he says, "Well, you want a tower? Why don't you just come over to my place and climb the tower?" And I was like 15 years old at the time, and he was maybe 18 years old, and this is also at his parents' house. And I said, I kind of looked at the tower, and I said, "Okay, I'll give this a try." So I started climbing this tower. It was a freestanding, 50-foot tower with his tri-bander on top. A 2-story house. And by the time I got to the eaves of the second floor, the roof line, I looked up, I looked down, and I froze.
Did you have a climbing belt?
No, it wasn't necessary. Everybody knows that teenagers are immortal.
That's what I remember. I remember when I was climbing as a teenager that somebody would hand me from field day a belt with a hemp rope that went around the tower.
Yes.
Old hemp rope that went around the tower. And you didn't think anything about it, like maybe it was rotten or anything. You just climbed the tower and walked out on the cross arms if there were cross arms, and then you clipped yourself in. Because, of course, if you fell, you could fly.
Of course. But, you're not going to fall. Of course not. I did a lot of climbing without any safety equipment at all when I was a teenager because it was difficult. I couldn't afford a climbing belt. Trying to get the club belt, was a long, drawn-out process. And you want to climb, you want to climb. You're a teenager. Every minute counts. You
could pretzel your leg through the tower to kind of wrap it around and keep you from falling, right? You were now a part of the tower.
That's right. I just, put a few tools and parts in my jean pocket, and climb up there, even in the middle of winter, with, Winnipeg climate is quite cold. I figure anything above about, minus 10 Celsius was climbing weather. And, up you go. And, then you just kind of hook your arm around the tower and you reach into your pocket and pull out, a tool or whatever else. And you try to hold things with your hand that's going through the tower if you have to hold something, and it's extremely dangerous. I can't even imagine doing anything like that now, but you did it and you survived. But, I put up my first tower at my parents' and, I still remember, my mother, when she was out hanging laundry outside and I went to the tower, like she would run indoors. She says she knows that I'm trying to be safe and all that, but she says she just couldn't stand watching me climbing the tower up in the air. It was just too much.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I had 2 older sisters, and there was quite an age difference. In a way, it's I didn't have anybody in the house to talk radio with.
You were like almost an only child in terms of growing up and having the attention of your parents and the projects that you were doing.
That's correct. And they had nothing really to contribute because, they didn't have the education. They didn't really have the money to really help me along, but they did everything they could to foster my interest because they could see that I was moving in a good direction.
It's my understanding that you took a hiatus from ham radio in the middle of your professional career, and then you came back. Do you want to talk a little bit about the hiatus and how you came back?
Well, sure. When back in the, just to tell you a little bit how it's kind of going, I bought a house in Ottawa when I decided that I really was going to stay there. It would be my new home. I was still quite young, in my 20s, but, I was making, reasonably good, salary, being, a software developer and all that. And so I bought a house. It was not much, but it was good enough to put up a tower and, about 60 feet or something like that. And I set up a station there. But I found that after when I did that, I didn't use that much. Like until then, for the first few years in Ottawa, I was operating at other people's stations, and it was just contests. And I was just loving the idea of DX contests. Back when I was in Winnipeg, it was all domestic contests like ARRL sweepstakes, which was the big contest for us, because DX contests were pointless. But once I was out in Ottawa, DX contest became really big. And there was a friend of mine, Doug VE3VN, and he built a station at his parents' place out in the country. And he had one tower that was over 100 feet. And so we used to have a great time, CQ Worldwide, CQWPX, and we had a great time there. But that's the only time I could operate was really weekends when there was a contest there or one of my other friends. So I had my own station, but I found the time involved in building my own station and then having to operate it, it just really cut into my time. I was busy at work. I mean, I was a young man. I had a busy social life, the dating, a little bit of partying, or just, hanging out with friends and all that sort of stuff. And I didn't really want to do it. And I started spending less time in the shack, or I started focusing. I might spend a lot of time focusing on 6 meters, especially towards the late 80s when we had that really beautiful solar maximum. And I was working DX all over the world on 6 meters, although I was missing out a lot because, of course, a lot of it was during the day when I was at work. But so that was one of my passions. And it didn't take all that much time because the band wasn't open. It wasn't open. But for HF, I found that my interests were kind of elsewhere. My neighbors were very politely telling me about their stereos and everything else going crazy when I used the amplifier. And at the time, I had bought a really beautiful old-time amplifier, Collins 30S1. The floor-standing model. It's a beautiful amplifier. That I bought it from a guy who was moving, but he was a bit of a Collins collector himself, but he didn't need it. And he has since moved to South America, of all things. But anyway, I used that, but I couldn't really use it above like 80 meters because it would just wipe out several of my neighbors. And, I didn't want that stress in my life as well. I used to chase down these problems and help solve them, but it was a lot of stress, and it was like one thing on top of another. And eventually a time came, and I decided, okay, I have to knock down this. Was basically a shack. It wasn't much of a house, and away it went. And I built a new house, and that's when I realized my heart wasn't in it anymore. The contest station that my friend Doug VE3VN had, the big tower came down in a storm, and he was basically out of a contest station himself. And, the couple of the other guys who I knew around Ottawa who were big contesters moved away, or they were a little bit younger than me, and they had no stations either. And eventually I just kind of threw my hands up in the air and I said, I'm going to focus on my career. I'm going to focus my time on my social life. And there wasn't really time for anything else.
How long were you out?
20.
Professionally, what did you do during that 20 years? Because you find yourself back in the Shield. We can talk a little bit about that, but you mentioned that you're kind of back on the Shield in Canada and no longer in Ottawa. So how did you find your way back to the middle of the country?
I was still in Ottawa, and I actually came back to the hobby in basically the end of 2012, beginning of 2013. And I lived in that house until late 2016. So I've been living here for about 6.5 years at this particular property. But back then, the Shield Rock, I should just mention where I lived. I lived a stone's throw from the Ottawa River, which is a very large river. It's about 2 to 3 kilometers across. It's the one that divides VE2 and VE3. And it is basically a cutting into the Shield Rock, Canadian Shield Rock, and it's a very hard rock. It's the bedrock around here. So where I was, just maybe 200 meters from the shoreline, there was 1 foot of topsoil and bedrock. So when I put a tower in there, I actually rented an air compressor, a diesel generator, powered by diesel, and were essentially back then we called jackhammers or breakers, hydraulic breakers. And we had to, after digging down 1 foot, we had to take out the rock, go down another 3 feet through the bedrock, because you put like a chisel or a pickaxe on it, it just bounced off. The rock was that hard. And I remember one of my neighbors at the time, he came over when I was looking at the rock, and he'd lived in the area, he and his family for quite many years, and I knew him because he was an engineer and he also worked at the same company. And he says, "You're not going to get through that." And I remember sitting in this hole, it's like 1 inch deep, and I looked up at him and I said, "Gord, this rock is coming out one way or another." And he kind of looked at me, you could see how serious I was. He said, "Oh." And a few days later, in rolled the breaker. And a couple of friends took a day off work, and the three of us, we made a tower hole.
So you came back and you moved to the Midwest. Can we call it the Midwest? Is that what you are?
No, I mean...
Well, when I think of Ottawa, I think it's kind of northeast. And when I think of where you are now, I kind of think of almost like you've moved west but north of the American West.
Well, I mean, I grew up, north of the American, west. I don't really know what you even call it there, but the American prairie, because of course the prairie doesn't care about the border. VE4, like Winnipeg, southern Manitoba, is at the edge of the prairie. The prairie kind of angles up at a northwest angle, through the middle of Saskatchewan, and finally, running into a brick wall in Alberta. And once you go a little bit north and east of Winnipeg is where, the shield, Canadian shield topology. Winnipeg is about, depending on where you go down, the actual shield is basically, it's old mountain ranges is what a lot of it is. So if you can imagine that there are mountains below your feet, heavily eroded mountains that age back, at least 1 billion years. And they were filled in by glaciation and everything else by sediments. And so it's completely flat on the surface. In fact, southern Manitoba, that whole area is a floodplain. The Red River, which starts, is the border between North Dakota and Minnesota. And you can see the headwaters, south of Fargo, North Dakota, and you'll go down that way. And it just gets bigger and bigger and flatter as you go north before it empties into Lake Winnipeg, which eventually takes you up after several hundred more kilometers out to Hudson's Bay. But it's the flooding is terrible around there. And they actually, when they built the flood protection for Winnipeg, the Great Winnipeg Floodway, they actually had to do a lot of blasting through the Canadian shield rock. So there's a lot of blasting going on for many years in the early 60s to build that and to provide the flood protection for the city of Winnipeg. Back in Ottawa, which is the same shield rock, but there it's much closer to the surface on general. It goes deep down in the prairie. It becomes close to the surface as you approach the Ontario border with VE3, and it basically stays that way all the way out until you start running into the newer rock in towards Quebec, and also into the Appalachians, down in the U.S. and New England area. It's all part of a continuity, but here we're sort of on the edge or that boundary between where the shield rock predominates and the newer sedimentary rock that you see in the Adirondacks and the Appalachians and so on.
You have a very strong background in geology as well.
Not really. I have to know all this because after I came back to amateur radio in 2013, and I started off really small, knowing my background and my interests. Now, I should also point out by that time, I had been working on other people's stations all along. I've built, by that time, many big towers for up to 150 feet. And I had all that experience in my back pocket because I always dreamt that one day I would do it. So I used to, I always say, especially through my 20s, every weekend I was on a tower. I was doing tower work. And I have done so many towers. I put them up, taken them down, built them, antennas up and down for just about anyone, friends of friends of friends, people I have no idea who they are, and I don't even remember them. And I just did it because I loved towers. Never charged a penny for any of it. I just like doing it. I had a decent salary. I didn't need the money. I just loved helping out. And so I built my chops, long before I decided to put up this particular station I'm at right now. But the shield rock out here, now I mentioned, you talk about, is it west, northeast, whatever. Like if you go straight south, I mean, you end up, I think, somewhere around Florida. And so, the North American continent kind of widens out towards the north. So, here, if I go a little bit, let's just put it this way. If I want to reach the Atlantic Ocean, the quickest route to it is through the United States. If I try to do it through Canada, it's a long, long ways away. And I've done that drive many times. I mean, from here, one of the other passions I have is cycling. And I have cycled from here to the Atlantic coast in Maine many times, as part of groups of friends, doing that. And it's only a little over 600 kilometers or about 400 miles, I guess, for Americans. And but you can't do that in Canada. You're looking at about maybe 1,500 kilometers to get anywhere near, like, say, the shore of the Atlantic shore of Nova Scotia. It's much, much farther away.
When you said that you kind of had to learn this stuff about the geology, yesterday was Israeli Independence Day. The way we celebrate it is we go to people's houses and we have barbecues. The Israeli public consumes a massive amount of barbecue on that day. And I'm actually with some people our age, in our 60s, and ham radio came up because one of the guests happened to be a ham radio operator who just moved to Jerusalem. They said, well, what good is ham radio? So I used an example I heard this last week about getting a 222 megahertz STL transmitter from a radio station, had a bunch of surplus equipment sitting in their back room. I went through this whole thing about the skill you had to do to kind of refurbish it, and then you decide, well, what am I going to do with it? Well, so maybe I'll do moon bounce with it, and so I have to build some antennas. So what I ended up doing was laying out for them all of the skills that you actually have to acquire in order to be able to do this aspect of ham radio, because it just so happens somebody gave us a 222 megahertz STL transmitter. So what came from the gift of the transmitter is a whole project that results in working EME or Aurora or meteor scatter, and all of the skills that are involved in just being able to make that one contact. And it sounds to me like you're typical of a lot of hams that I want to do ham radio. I want to put up a tower. I'm sitting on the Canadian Shield. The bedrock is a few feet below the ground, and this is how I'm learning all of this geology is a result of trying to solve a ham radio problem.
That's basically it. And I've run into this problem many times with friends. I remember putting in a 100-foot tower for a friend of mine. This is back about, well, it was in around 1985. I'm still in my 20s, and Brian, who's still, kicking. I mean, he's in his late 80s now, but V3 Charlie Roger George, he's a British import, he and his wife, and they had a place, west of Ottawa, and he was right on the rock. And we were putting in a 100-foot tower, and we were doing it with hand tools. Going through at least there, the shale wasn't too bad, but I don't know how many weekends I was over there with hand tools going through the shale until we got a hole big enough that we could plant the tower in it and bring in the concrete truck. But this has happened many times. I know people who have given up putting up towers because of the rock. What they do here is you don't always realize it. Like in Canada, almost every home has a basement. Well, how can you have a basement and not be able to put in a tower? But if you look at the houses, they're built up. They're built in with fill. You try to get deep enough with the basement to do that. I know when I built my house back in 92, 93, I had to bring in one of those big breakers. You don't even want to know how much they cost an hour to run. You just sit there chewing your fingernails while it's breaking rock, because we have to go down about 2 feet. And once we did that, there was enough clearance to get the property up above high enough to put in enough fill to get a sign off on the septic system, because it has to be the surface has to be about, I think, 5 feet above the bedrock for you to get a permit to put in a septic system. So everything kind of gets raised. In fact, you can always tell where the rock is close to the surface when you're shopping for houses, is the house is raised more than you would consider normal.
So let's talk a little bit about what's the current rig and what do you do with it?
Well, I mostly DX and contest. That's what I do here.
Okay, so your favorite activity is DXing and contesting?
That's right.
And what is your favorite contest?
I can't say that I really have one. It depends on when you ask me. Certainly, CQ Worldwide has to be near the top, especially CW. I still have a lot of nostalgia for sweepstakes, although this is a horrible part of the country to operate sweepstakes because the skip zone kind of goes over all the major population centers in the U.S. From here, like New York, which I've driven down to, many times because a cousin of mine lived there. For your interest, actually, he grew up mostly in Israel, and he loved barbecue as well, by the way. And it was, I think it's about a 700-kilometer drive, 400 and something miles, I think. And well, that's too close for like 20 meters. You just go right over the top. So you miss out on a lot of that. But, it's still just for nostalgia purposes. But I do it differently. What I do, like, for example, last year in the CW sweepstakes, I went in as QRP, running 5 watts. And I must also point out, as much as big as my station is, and I have a shack with 2 big amplifiers in it, but I still love QRP as well.
What's the current rig?
The current rigs are a Yaesu. It's a Yaesu station, an FTDX 5000. I also have an old FT 950 as my second radio. I've always just a little habit. I tend to stick with Yaesu rigs, but I will probably be changing. If I can find maybe a used K3, or I may go with, say, something like an ICOM 7610. And I'm going to be changing out everything here. I have the amplifiers. One is a fairly new ACOM A1500, and the other for the second station is an old Drake L7. It has a couple of 3500Zs in it, and both amplifiers work great. The station's really nice. And got all the peripheral equipment. You can't quite see it. It's just kind of like on the video. It's kind of just off to my right side, which is where, because I'm actually in the shack, but I kind of use like a home office is where the computer I'm using right now. But it's kind of off to the side. I can always turn the camera over there if you're interested.
Do you operate SO2R in contesting?
Yes, I do. I also do 2BSIQ, which is basically running on 2 bands simultaneously. I'm not particularly good at it yet, but I do it. And really, that's the only way to be really competitive. I did that. It was QRP, and mentioning ARRL sweepstakes, QRP, and I won. I came in first in the category, and those results were just published actually in May QST. For that contest. And so I do that. So I have all the SO2R, peripherals. I have all the computer software. All the station automation here is all my custom-built software. I wrote all the software, assembled all the switching hardware, so that when I change bands, the antenna changes, the directions change, all the bandpass filters change, everything. You just hear like this clunk of relays all over the place.
Sounds like an old Western Electric switch room.
Yeah, but the actual main switching center, for actually all the antenna switching, is actually, it's remote. It's out the base of one of the towers. I do that, although it's a little bit more inconvenient for maintenance, especially in the winter. It also means I only have to bring in 2 runs of coax into the house to access the entire HF station. And I have a third coax that comes in for 6 meters.
And how many towers do you have out in your acreage now?
Yeah, everybody asks me that, and I'm never really quite sure. It's not that huge, but just to give you a rundown, I have 2 big guide towers. One is 150 feet, the other is 140. Then my small freestanding tower is about 70 feet. I have another tower that is the driven element and support for my 3-element vertical Yagi on 80 meters. And I also have another tower that's really just off to the side that isn't being used right now, but it's only about 30 or 40 feet. And I have another tower lying on the ground that I'm going to make use of. But I don't want, like I could put it at this point, at this point I can get towers for essentially nothing. I have enough contacts. In fact, a lot of this station was built with stuff that I got free. It's amazing what you can do when you scrounge around and you know a few people in the commercial tower business. And I have gotten some amazing deals, and people, I mean, these are just typical businessmen, have been incredibly good to me, loaning me equipment, helping me out. But aside from actually planting the towers with the big heavy equipment, the backhoes and everything else, which I did get help with professionals, everything else I did myself. All the tower raising and all the antenna raising with the help of a few friends.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. One of the things that you've done, because in researching you, and also you were recommended by somebody that shares the Ham Radio Club with you, you write a blog, and it looks like you started that blog about the same time you decided to get interested again in having your own ham radio station. So what was it that caused you to decide to write the blog? And I'm going to put a link in the show notes page for everyone, because Ron's blog is written like a laboratory workbook. It appears to me, anyway. You are amazing at documenting and taking pictures of what it is you're doing and what you're thinking about. And what impressed me also was this love that you have of scrounging whatever you can or reusing whatever surplus you can in order to keep the price down. And I think that's why I'm recommending your blog, is because I think that we have to buy everything. We have to have new everything in order to make it work. And there's so much. I'm at a point in my life right now where I'm so angry, and it's my fault for being angry. I shouldn't be angry, but with most ham radio vendors, I'm just going to build the stuff myself, or I'm going to retask things that weren't meant for ham radio to be used for ham radio. So how did you start this blog, and how is it that you've become so good at making this documentation and doing these projects?
Well, first off, writing is not something I just kind of just walked into. Being a professional, and although I said I started as a computer programmer, I only actually did that really professionally for the first 5 years of my career. And then I started moving into more business roles. I became very much involved in industry standards and things like that in telecommunications. So I understand a lot about how pretty well any telecommunication network works, but there was a lot of writing involved in that. There was a lot of management, product management, project management, different roles throughout my career in telecommunications and just software in general. At the business side, I did marketing. I even did sales for a while, and communication is important. I was also very good at writing marketing material. Whenever somebody in a small company I was in, we needed to write some marketing thing, people would come to me and say, "We need this," and I would just rattle it off, and after a couple of edits, that's it. It was ready to go. So I do have a background in business writing. So writing is easy for me. I know some people I know I discussed this, my friend Steve, V6WZ, and he has a very popular YouTube channel with his station that he's built. And he's a low band guy, mostly 160, but he also has, Yagis on 40 and 80, and he has a remote station off in the wilds of Alberta. And but he decided, well, he's been writing things his entire life. I think he worked in geophysics. I don't know if it was the oil industry out there or minerals. And he decided he didn't want to do that anymore, so he picked up a camera. And he has a very popular YouTube channel. But me, I just love writing. And so I stuck with it. I figured when I got back into the hobby, I said, well, let me document it and let's just see what happens. I said, I would be interested in reading about somebody who was doing what I was doing. So maybe there's somebody out there who would be interested. And I started writing. And at first, on my pace of writing, just saying, well, this is what I'm doing. These are the problems I've run into. I'm always eager to share my failures. I will show you, there are pictures throughout my blog of broken pipes and other things that have failed, things that I've overlooked and it caused, minor disasters and things like that. And we all have them, but we don't talk about them. And I want people to see me talking about and owning up, this happened to me, this is why it happened, and this is how I resolved it. That's very important, especially, because people think they have to be perfect. Because people, they always say, like, it's reading a science paper. Because one of my things is I read a lot of astrophysics papers when they first come out as preprints on areas of interest to me, like general relativity and stuff like that. And I go through these things, and they're written like perfectly, like everything was. It was fine. It's like reading about clinical trials for new drugs and things like that. You don't see the 100 times as much stuff that went on behind the science and all the failed steps, scrapping this, trying something different, and on and on and on. They just give you the final picture. I want people to see it as a journey, not as an end result. A lot of hams, when they have websites, they do them as reference works, which are wonderful. You say you want to know something about matching networks, for example. Well, here's my page on matching networks, and they just update the page as they learn new things or they correct mistakes. I do as a blog because I say, for me, it's about the journey. You can follow me along as I go through all of this, my successes, my failures, what I've accomplished, what I've learned, and it might inspire you to try something you have never tried before. Push yourself out of your comfort zone, watch somebody else who's done it and done it wrong, and then done it right, what I learned along the way, how I went about actually learning how to do things, and hopefully that will teach someone how to learn. Because, of course, that's the main point of education. You learn how to learn.
Right, and ham radio is the license to learn.
Exactly. These days, I was never bored of ham radio. It just didn't fit in my life for 20 years. But there's always something new. I will never be bored by this hobby, no matter what comes in future. And so I love writing, and people follow along. And I don't. If you look at my blog, you'll find that there aren't that many comments on the articles. I hear a lot more directly from readers who will ask me for advice on this and that, and say, I want to do this. What do you think? And just explore a few options. And I'm always happy to accommodate. I get questions like, for example, I've torn apart and reassembled prop pitch motors to turn my big arrays, like the 3-element 40-meter Yagi. And I get questions because people could just have difficulty getting good information. Like usually the best stuff that you found on the internet was from Kurt, K7NV. And several months ago, he became a silent key, unfortunately. And when a friend of mine who's also used a lot of prop pitch motors, he told me about it. He found out about the next day, and we both mirrored his website because there was just so much good information there. But then I get questions from people about prop pitch motors, and I answer those questions as well as I can. I'll say, well, this is what I've done. I've got a lot of parts lying around because I've mixed and matched from different motors to get one that actually works properly. And so I have a lot of fun with that. And I just talk about all that in the blog.
I think it's amazing. It's very well done. You've got maybe over 500 entries. It's hundreds of entries.
Well, I'll tell you what's happened is that when I started in the early days, I didn't know if I was going to stick with it. And as you know what it's like, when you first start something, you have these tons of ideas, circling your head. And so at first, the pace of articles was fairly quick, came out very fast. It might be like 2 a week. And then I realized, that's not sustainable. And I slowed down. I just let it happen organically. And then I realized that my pace, for whatever reason, seemed to be about one a week. And it seems like I was looking at your archives, and you seem to have a similar pace for QSO Today. And that's really what you're really doing, is counting the number of weeks for when I got back in the air, back in early 2013.
I think the reason for QSO Today going weekly is because it seems to me that you have to get into a rhythm when you're doing a project like this, or when you're doing a blog. They say that successful authors like Stephen King, for example, if we're using a fictional writer, has to sit down every day and do the craft, or it just doesn't get done. And to do what you're doing, writing a blog, or for me, doing the podcast, it has to become part of the rhythm of my weekly life in order for it to get done. I mean, I have to set aside the 10 hours that it takes to put the whole thing together, including the interview, in such a way that I always publish. Otherwise, I wouldn't. If I did it once a month, it would be much harder to do it once a month than to do it every week. Then you'd always move your schedule around and you'd say, well, how committed am I this month? I guess that's kind of my thinking, is you have to turn things into a habit in order to make them a regular part of your life.
Well, absolutely. And I would tend to agree with you. There were a couple of years where during the summer I would try to reduce my pace because I was very busy with other things. Just to mention, like, amateur radio isn't the only thing I do. Another one of my passions is sports like cycling, especially, and I also do a lot of running. To the point where I was quite competitive in my master's age classes as I was going through this. I've cycled with professional athletes and all that sort of thing. I'm strong enough. So, but you have to. That's one of those things as well. Physically, it's use it or lose it. And so sometimes you will have to go out and do it. Like, for example, this morning, and I'm not much of a morning person. And as I get older, I'm a little bit slower to kind of get going in the morning. And I decided, I said, well, I really need to do a run today. And then I got, your interview coming up, around midday. And I figured, well, I'm not going to do it. And then I kind of said, no, I can't do that. I have to go out. So I put on my shoes and I went and ran 5 kilometers and said, okay, I got that out of the way. Now I can focus on the other things. So you have to maintain that routine, that rhythm, as you say. And I found that with the blog now, because I'm conscious of that once a week, seems to be very natural for me. It doesn't push me too hard. I have the time to do it because I'm retired, and I can fit it in without it being a problem. Sometimes, an article will just start getting written because I just kind of like ran into something. Like the last article on my blog, if you go there, is one about end connectors.
Right. I read it.
And how awful they are. It is because I was just dealing with it because I had an end connector go bad on me. And I talk about that actually in the article. It was one of the splices between 2 lengths of Heliax hardline. And there was really nothing wrong with it, but end connectors are so finicky. And, trying to connect 2 pieces of hardline is always a problem. But anyway, and my 80-meter Yagi was basically out of service for a few months because I couldn't really look at it during the winter. And I assumed it was something electrical. And it turned out to be that after I finally got out there, tore everything apart, and found the antenna was fine. And then I just kind of like sectionalized, the transmission line and everything else. And it's another one of those dreaded end connectors. And people talk about them and they say, well, I think that deserves an article.
It was a very good article, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes page as well. And I saw that you actually have some stuff up on YouTube, but it looks like it's part of an amateur radio club that you belong to.
Not really. I mean, I have been asked to give video presentations to various clubs. I did one nationally for Radio Amateurs of Canada, RAC, our national organization, which I guess I'm a life member of that as well as ARRL. And I've been actually a life member of ARRL for like 45 years. But anyway, so they asked me to do a talk on 6 meters. And I've also given in person and also via Zoom talks about my station, 6 meters or something else, when they ask. So I've done it in person. When it comes to like amateur radio clubs, especially the more local ones, and I know this may come across a little bit wrong, but I don't belong to any. And I haven't since I was still living in Winnipeg, and that was in the 1970s, because I found that your typical amateur radio club, although they're full of wonderful people doing amazing things, none of those things interest me. When you get into the things like, serious DXing, building towers, getting at the serious contesting, and some of the other weird things that contesters do at their stations, where all the choreography you have to do between receivers and transmitters and everything else in a modern contest station, and being interested in propagation and stuff like that, and some of the crazy things I build. None of them do any of that, and a lot of clubs, to be frank, spend far too much time on administration matters when they have their meetings. About the only clubs I really am a member of, other than national societies, one is the Ottawa Valley QRP Club, and the only reason I can handle that is, QRP is great, but mostly what they are is not so much QRPers as they are makers. They're builders. They like playing and building small stuff, taking that stuff onto a mountaintop, peaks on the air and other such things like that, parks on the air, and they do some very innovative stuff, and they do it all with low power. And the important thing is the monthly meetings are held in a pizza parlor. And it's pizza and beer. There's no agenda. We just sit there chatting. It's been interrupted by COVID, but it's been slowly, getting started again. And the other club that I'm a member of is Contest Club Ontario, which is a very large club of contesters in VE3, because VE3, the population is quite large at about 15 million. So, of course, a very large amateur population. And so we all operate together. We contribute club scores. So I have many dozens of stations putting together a club score for the various big contests. We also run the Ontario QSO party, the various state and provincial QSO parties, which are all part of the QSO Party Challenge, which is itself a big operating event. And so we do that. And like in this last one we had, which is actually this month in April, I operated one of the bonus stations, which was VA3 CCO, of course, being for Contest Club Ontario. So we do that. And we have also yearly barbecues at the home of, Uber contester John V3EJ in Southern Ontario. And he has a very high profile internationally in the contesting community, and he's, we're approximately the same age. He's maybe a couple of years older, and he got into contesting around the same time I did. And he has an amazingly huge station. So we all gather there, in August, have a barbecue. It's like a 500-kilometer drive each way. From where I am. Actually, it's a little bit less now since I moved out of Ottawa, so it's about 400 really, about 400 kilometers, and which is fine, except you have to cross Toronto, which is not fun. Not fun. It's one of those cities where you do not want to try to get across.
I've tried once.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. I think I've had more luck, driving around New York City than I have around Toronto. But anyway, it's still worth it because you get together with, sometimes 40, sometimes 80 of your fellow contesters, and it's a great get together. We don't discuss a lot of business. Mostly it's chatting, checking out, what John's been doing to his station, and he's also like a really super nice guy, and I could also consider him a modern mentor because he's been playing with things like prop pitch motors and big towers. Like he is a broadcast engineer, and he worked for one of the big tower companies in Canada for a large part of his working career. Not so much on the climbing, although he is also an excellent climber as well. So he homebrews his own station as well. And up to the point of having a vertical Yagi on 160 meters because he loves top band. And he's also gotten into 6 meters as well. But he's also great because I have a problem with a prop pitch motor or a question about the class of tower I have, which is comes from the company he worked for, which no longer exists. It's called LeBlanc and Royal. And that was a Canadian national company, and they had their own tower line that they manufactured. So a lot of the surplus towers coming from decommissioned AM stations and so on are their 20-inch face tower, which is rated for 300 feet. And both my big towers are that LR20. And I had some experience. A guy helped a friend put up a 150-foot LR20 tower in Saskatchewan, back about 35 years ago. And he was putting up a 40-meter Yagi. So, I was still living here at the time. I actually flew out for a bit of vacation and helped him out. And that was kind of interesting. So I've had a lot of experience with the tower, so it's great. So I'm familiar with it.
Do you think that the interest that you have in contesting and the interest that you have in towers, do you think that there's a way to kind of make that interesting to younger prospective hams? Have you had any thoughts on how we might attract new hams to the hobby? Because it seems to me that everything you're doing is very interesting. Can we interest younger people in those things?
Yes and no. What I find with young adults these days, and I'm not talking about kids, I'm talking about young adults who are starting their careers, starting their families, and as you may know what the situation is like here, Canada, I know the U.S. is very similar, is real estate prices have been going through the roof. And it's very difficult. They're struggling to meet their mortgages. They have if they have anything, it's like a small townhouses or row houses or whatever term is used. Sometimes they might call them condos, all attached. And there's like no room for towers. And they don't know anything about towers. They got them into radio, usually because of the technology these days, or they like making things. And putting it on the air is one way to get interest. In towers, well, they kind of look at it and say, that would be lovely to have something like that, but I don't know anything about towers. I don't know how to build them, and I don't have the room to put one up. So they're not putting up towers. I know a lot of the younger generation, and there aren't that many of them, unfortunately, as you know. And a lot of them are using indoor antennas. They're stringing little bits of wires or, from a tree or planting a vertical in the backyard, trying to keep the neighbors happy, trying to keep their families happy. And there's not a lot of that going on. So they love visiting a station like mine and kind of going, the oohing and the eyeing, which is fine. I'm always happy to have them come over and have a look. But they'll never build it. For the newer generation, I find, like a lot of contesters, you may have noticed that a lot of them now, with the way that they're doing their big contesting is through remotes. So a lot of the big contest stations now, they even will do a hybrid where they'll have local contesters and local operators and remote operators, or sometimes all remote. And there are some hams, like I know Jerry W1VE, he's also Canadian. I'm not sure where his primary citizenship is, but he's W1VE, and he also has a VE1 call sign, and he's very, very big and remote. He's operated all over the place. He's tried to talk me into remoting my station, but because everything is homebrew and so forth, that's going to be a long haul. So I told him not to hold his breath. But that's how you get a lot of guys. I know there are like a young guy who are using the SO2R box that I'm using for switching here, Marty. I think it's NN1C, I think his call sign is. He's a young guy, and he does everything by remote. Because, he certainly doesn't have a big station. He's never going to have one. And it's a good way to get the younger generation who are keen on contesting. And in contesting may be one of the major activities that is still left when our generation is another 20 years older.
You may be right. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Technology. Because of my background, I always loved technology, but the things that you can do now, it's not just the remoting. It's all the SDR. Now we can now do direct sampling right through the HF spectrum and even into the VHF spectrum. Is amazing because everything gets computerized. Like, for example, I wrote my own software. There's no box sitting on my desk on how you control the station. Everything is either automatic or you click on a mouse with a mouse. And eventually, as I progress the software, it'll be on a touch screen because a mouse still slows you down in a contest. You have to kind of roll around, find the right button out of the corner of your eye, and frankly, touching a screen without a mouse in between would make it 10 times easier and fewer mistakes. I find in the heat of a contest, I clicked the wrong button. So I may change the stack arrangement for the other radio that I'm operating, not the one that I actually wanted to change on. For the stack that I have on 2015 and 10. So, but all those controls are right on the screen. I just fit it in, among the N1MM windows, which is my contest logger. And in fact, I use it as an everyday logger as well. So I use the same software for daily DXing, if you like. Everything is all integrated together. I have to make that choice. N1MM does all the heavy lifting of talking to the rigs. It sends me all the information I could possibly want, and I use that to drive the user interface on the screen. And then I have hidden under the desk where you can't see it, a big Arduino Mega with a huge stack of relays, endless amounts of control wires all over the place, which then run by cables out to a patch panel in the basement and then out to the switching center at the base of the tower, and then it goes through underground cables, throughout the hay fields and everything else to all the antennas, along with the rotator cables and all the hard line to go to all the antennas and so forth. So all that's going on under the desk.
So there's no shortage of technology when you're building a contest station.
No.
Right, especially if you're running SO2R. There's no shortage of things that you can do and to always improve the station.
Yes. And it's not just the stuff you can do locally. It's also the social aspects of technology. For example, there are sites where you can register at the beginning of the contest, and you can monitor the scores as the contest progresses of everybody else you're competing against. It's almost like an e-games. A lot of people are getting heavily into that. It's something that the younger hams really like. There's other things like PSK Reporter. Like, for example, when I operate on 6 meters, and I know a lot of my friends in the QRP club and like building things like in Whisper, WSPR, the part of the digital modes that are going around these days. And you can actually instantly see if you send a CQ, like, for example, if I'm on 6 meters FT8, I can find out who in the world is actually hearing my signal. And that is, again, somebody running a server somewhere. You get live streaming from DXpeditions. Am I in the log? Or do I call again because I wasn't quite sure? Well, it shows up instantaneously. You can monitor that. Again, technology is making that possible. Those are really, quite amazing things.
I'm capturing your excitement from this. Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
What I find is potential hams these days, along with most people, the idea of talking to somebody on the other side of the world is like, well, yeah, I do that all the time. Like, why is that interesting? So the idea of just talking isn't really interesting. The technology side of it, for people, I guess what they call them in STEM fields, amateur radio is a very quick, easy way to take your project and put it into the real world. You can get instant feedback. Did I do this right? Did I build it right? Even people who don't have licenses, they can do things like amateur radio on balloons. And I know there's one of the guys I know, and he's been getting involved in doing that. In fact, once he asked me if he could launch from my property because I have just about 50 acres. So it's a fairly large property. And so there's a lot of space, away from the towers and so on, where you can do that. He's never taken me up on it, but he's kind of planning, looking for launch sites, depending on the direction of the wind at the time and everything else. But there's things like that, and of course that's really big. High school students love doing that. Satellites, even if you don't have a license, again, you can listen in and see what's going on.
There's a lot of opportunities to try to sample ham radio in different ways, maybe to find the thing that you like, potentially.
Absolutely. 3D printers, people love making parts for antenna ideas they have and doing 3D. And I don't do it myself, but apparently there are endless thousands of projects for hams that are public. You just download those templates feed it into your 3D printer, and out comes whatever that device is.
Well, you know what? I have a 3D printer. I never used it, although I want the benefits of it. So I gave it to a teenager 2 doors down, and that thing runs 24/6 for the last 2 years. So anything I need, I send over, and he'll manufacture it for me, and I have the benefit of 3D printing, but I've turned this teenage kid into an expert on CAD and 3D printing. And his mother. His mother does it too.
Yes.
Kind of an amazing thing.
The other thing about technology, is digital. Digital modes. I know a lot of guys our age who really try to diss it. And I don't understand that. Let's put it this way. I would rather have a CW QSO than an FT8 QSO. But the digital technology is wonderful. Like, for example, I remember back in the late 70s, one of the guys who's actually still very active today, he was a moon bouncer, EME, Barry Malawanchuk, VE3MA. Sorry, VE4MA. This is back in Winnipeg. And he's still very active on moon bounce. And back then, I remember a group of us went over there. I think it was a university at the time. I was probably about 20 years old. And he would sit there on 432 megahertz with his parabolic dish in the backyard, and he was demonstrating, these racks of equipment and this huge amplifier, to send, the typical, O's, the long dashes, and you kind of listen through all the noise and listen to this. He said, I think I heard that coming back. He says, yeah, that was definitely it. You can, and every now and then you get like a very clear O back after about, 2.5 seconds for the time delay on the return trip. And that was just fascinating. Like, I would never do EME, but it's great. But the thing is, now with digital modes, like with K1JT, Joe Taylor, the things he's done in the early days. First, it revolutionized moon bounce. You can now do moon bounce. You don't have like a huge dish like Barry had at the time. You can do it with even one long boom 2-meter Yagi, because the extra dB of signal to noise ratio you gain with the digital modes is amazing. And I say this amazing because I have professionally done DSP programming, not for the sort of things we do in amateur radio. So I know I have an appreciation for just how awesome what they've done with those digital modes. So the technology is fascinating alone. So now you can do that with things like moon bounce. I do it like on 6 meters. I use it primarily on 6 because with sporadic key, everything is so sporadic, and that's the way you work DX. Like, I'm not interested in, no offense to my American friends, but working another W4 on 6 meters does not interest me. That's easy on 6 meters. I want to work Europe. I want to work Africa. I want to work the South Pacific. And those openings that have always been there, since the start of amateur radio, that we never knew about, because they would come up for like a minute and then they would vanish. And you can monitor everybody all at once on the watering hole at 50.313 megahertz. And it has been a boon. Since I turned to digital on 6 meters back about, whenever it was, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I now have 122 DXCC countries on 6 meters FT8. That's not counting anything else. 120.
That's pretty amazing, Ron.
It is.
And what you're also demonstrating is that you can be in any part of the world. As you described Canada, I was thinking, this has got to be a terrible place for ham radio, but it sounds to me like just about any place is a good place for ham radio if you have the right amount of expertise, you have the right amount of equipment, or the right kind of equipment. And sometimes I think maybe it's not even the right kind of equipment. It's really how you use whatever equipment you have.
Yes. Like the one thing I was going to say, the reason I started talking about that was I was actually roundabout answering your question about the young hams. Because a lot of them with the small stations, FT8 has been a godsend to them. They are now able to work DX with an indoor antenna running no more than 100 watts, sometimes a lot less. I know guys that do that, and they're thrilled.
You can buy a QRP Labs digital box the size of a package of cigarettes that you can plug into your laptop computer, take into a park, and work the digital modes on 4 bands.
Yes.
That's pretty amazing when you consider
And that is what they do.
Right. Under $100.
And the thing is, for the young guys, and it's all no code licenses these days. I mean, a lot of them learn CW after the fact, because especially the guys who like QRP and things like that, it's very handy. CW gets through when the other modes do not. Either that or digital, if you get tired of digital. But the thing is, again, digital modes have been a godsend for a lot of young amateurs. They're not interested in contesting. They like making stuff. They love the idea of working DX with almost nothing. It's fascinating. And doing what you said, is taking a small station out in the field, running off a little battery, and using digital modes and work the world. And that's great. And all I say is more power to them. If they ever want to try CW, I'll help them along.
Ron, I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise. One of the things that strikes me again is having very humble beginnings as an amateur radio operator. It seems to me that kind of stuck through your amateur radio career, and that is you can always do more with less. It builds a tremendous amount of expertise over the period of time that you're doing it, and it creates an opportunity for you to share that with the rest of the ham radio community, and we just benefit. So I want to thank you for all of that, and I want to thank you for being my guest on QSO Today.
Well, it was my pleasure, Eric. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I wish you a very good day in 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ron. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE3 Victor Nancy in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.